Hi, today I'm going to show you how to fill in the Adult Abroad General Passport Application form for Canadian passports. The form I'm going to be using is the one that is for Canadian citizens applying outside of Canada and from the USA. It has some slight variations to it, but it can also be used by Canadian citizens inside of Canada as well. So section 1, personal information. When filling in this section, I highly recommend that you have alongside this form your documentary evidence of citizenship. So it can be one of two things. If you're born inside of Canada, it will be your Canadian birth certificate, and if you're born outside of Canada, it will be your Canadian citizenship certificate, which would either most probably be a small wallet-sized, dual-sided, laminated photo card. And then more recently, since 2012, a A4 sized paper certificate, cream coloured, which is also dual sided, has been issued as well for Canadian citizens, which is their Canadian citizenship certificate. So you want to have one of those two documents with you, and that's what you'll use to fill in personal information section 1. So surname, you're going to fill in as your surname appears in either your Canadian birth certificate or your Canadian citizenship certificate. The only way you would be able to write down a name which is different to how it appears in your Canadian birth certificate or your Canadian citizenship certificate will be if you changed your name via marriage, and then what the other document that you would require when lodging an application with a marital surname would be your marriage certificate, and then also a supplementary form of ID, which we'll get down to in a later section of this application form, which would have your marital surname or the name that you would be requesting on this form. But to keep it simple, if no names have changed, it will be as per your birth certificate or Canadian citizenship certificate, as it will be applicable to your situation. So surname as it appears in the documentary evidence of citizenship, and then given name, so we'd put in your first names and middle names. Now if you're filling in given names, and let's say you have a given name and then a middle name, like you have John Matthew, but Matthew was just probably something you were given when you were born, and it would just appears on your birth certificate, but you don't really use it in day-to-day life, and you have supplementary ID which would provide later on with this application that omits the middle name Matthew, for example, then you can just have it as John. You don't need to add both names if you wish to have it as just one given name, and that given name is reflected on your ID, and the ID is showing your names as you would like them to appear. It kind of backs up for the passport process that's how you're going by day-to-day life. So that's the surname and then given names. If you had a surname that was different when you were born, so again, so for example, if you were married and you were wishing to have your surname in a marital surname, it will go here in the surname last name field, and then at surname last name at birth you would simply put your maiden surname, so the surname that you were born with, for example, and any former surnames that you may have had. So for example, if maybe you were previously married and then you were divorced subsequently, so you no longer go by that name, but you did have it at some point in your life, you'd list that in this field here. Next up, you'd have place of birth. So here, really straightforward. Again, if you have the Canadian birth certificate, that's even more straightforward because it actually lists the city. So for example, we'll say Hamilton, Ottawa, Toronto, North York, where it may be. So you just do it as it appears in your birth certificate. And then here in the country field, you can have a drop down list as well of whatever country you were born in. So Canada, United States are at the top, and then you can just find your corresponding country of birth as you scroll through that drop down list. And if you were born in for example in Canada or America, where there's a provinces and states, you can put down the province or state in this field as well, if applicable. Next up, date of birth, fairly straightforward, so as it will appear in either your Canadian birth certificate or your Canadian citizenship certificate. In the way you write it down is in year, month and day fashion. Next up is your gender, so female or male, you can tick either one of those boxes. After that will be natural eye color, so your eye color, not if you've got contact lenses on of any other color, just the eye color that you have right now, which is a natural eye color. And then height, so you can list that in either centimeters or inches. Then you have the current home address field, so This is the address you will put down of the address where you currently reside. So you want to put down the apartment or house number, street, and then apartments here as well. Depending on what country you live in, obviously addresses are formulated in different fashions, so you can just list it in the way that works best for you and flows correctly for the country that you're in. City and then country, and of course a postal or zip code if there is one that is applicable. The mailing address field you would only really fill in if it is different from your current home address. If you had opted for the passport to be delivered to you once it's complete at, let's say, a work address, then you would fill this in with your work address. Next up, you fill in a daytime telephone number, most probably a landline or a cell phone. Cell phone's probably going to be the best one, as you have it on you at all times. And if you have any other dedicated telephone lines that you are at throughout the day, so for example a work line maybe, and you list it here. And then an email address, which you can also list down. Highly recommend this. Email is definitely the go-to method for communications nowadays with organizations and clientele, and it's always helpful to have an email address as well if documentation needs to be moved back and forward as well. It's always an easier option, but still your choice. But for sure a daytime telephone number does need to be included. And then rounding out section 1 of this application, personal information, you're going to be signing and dating here. For sure, read the declaration so you completely understand what you're signing off. And then when you do sign, please do remember to sign only within this white space here. Do not veer out of the border. Do not write or sign over this writing here, because it will most probably lead to a rejection of this form, or at least, or at the very least, a delay of your application. So if you have a the boisterous signature, just kind of rein it in just a little bit and just make sure you sign within this white field here. And then you will date when you signed, and also finally you'll list the city and country you were in when you signed. Section 2, Declaration of Guarantor. So because I'm using the adult abroad application form, you actually get 2 criteria that you can pick for a guarantor for your application. The first one would be a Canadian passport holder. So the Canadian passport holder can act as your guarantor as long as they hold a valid Canadian passport which was issued to them when they were 16 years old or older. So basically it has to be an adult passport that they hold, and that they must at the time of signing this form, they must be at least 18 years old or older. That's how they qualify to be a guarantor using their Canadian passport. If their Canadian passport is expired, they can still act as a guarantor as long as that Canadian passport has not been expired for more than 1 year. So if you were to fill this in with a Canadian passport holder, the way they would fill in this section is, of course, I would highly recommend that they have their Canadian passport open in front of them when they fill this section in, and verbatim copying the information as it appears in their Canadian passport. This would highly speed things up and will not lead to any further delays or any more clarifications if names differ, for example, or passport numbers differ. So to make things really nice and easy, I would highly suggest making sure that the guarantor has their Canadian passport open in front of them and they just verbatim copy everything. So if they have any middle names, if they have a double-barreled surname, do exactly how it appears in their Canadian passport. Do not delineate away from the fashion in which your names appear in that Canadian passport. So they'll fill in the surname field, the given name field, and then here they're going to fill in the Canadian passport number only in this field. Okay, that's their job as a Canadian passport holding guarantor. That's the number that they'll put, which appears on the top right hand corner of page 3 of their passport, the bio page. That's the page with their photo on it and details on it. Top right hand corner is the passport number. And then a contactable number for them through the daytime. They may very well be contacted by the passport office to carry out a guarantor check. And then they would list the date of birth in passport. So they will list, as per their Canadian passport, the date of their birth here. And then they will finally put a current home address for themselves in this field as a Canadian passport holder. And then obviously they will want to read this declaration here. As well as filling in this section, they will also be signing on on the back of one of your photos. That's highly important. For sure, do not miss that out. If there's no signature on the back of photos, that's an automatic rejection. So make sure the guarantor, when they're filling this in, they're going to also sign on the back of one of your photos. And then they will list here the number of years that they've known the applicant for, and it has to be for at least 2 years. Okay, so that you have to bear in mind, at least 2 years the guarantor has to have known you for them to qualify as your guarantor. And do be advised that in this situation, anyone can act as your guarantor, including family or friends, as long as they hold a valid Canadian passport and they've known you for 2 years or more. That can be a guarantor for you, and that does not disqualify family or friends. So that might be a really simplistic thing. In most cases, you might just be able to find your guarantor literally in-house. And then finally, all important signature of guarantor here, the date of the signature, and then where they were when they signed, so the city and country where they signed at. Now, if you're opting for the second criteria, so an occupation-based guarantor, the way in which they will fill in this section is slightly different. So yes, they'll put down their surnames and given names, and basically the occupation is broken down. There's an exhaustive list within the instructions, but mainly it's occupations such as medical doctors, dentists, lawyers, vets, pharmacists, bank signing officers, dean or heads of universities, and judges, police officers. There's quite a wide-ranging list of occupations that are accepted. I highly implore reading the instructions because they're all outlined there. And then from one of those occupations, the guarantor can act for you. It's not based on their nationality, it's just based purely on their occupation, and that they make sure that they practice the occupation in the country where the passport is being lodged. For example, if it's in the United Kingdom, they are practicing within the United Kingdom their job. If it's in Hong Kong, they're practicing within Hong Kong, etc. And again, they have to have also have known you, the applicant, for at least 2 years to qualify as your guarantor. So they'll put their surnames and first names, and then instead of passport number, because obviously they don't hold a Canadian passport, they're going to put their occupation title. So for example, they could put medical doctor, lawyer, barrister, solicitor, bank manager, or a judge, like criminal judge, for example, or pharmacist. That's what they can put here. And again, they will put a daytime telephone number to be contacted. They very well may be contacted for a guarantor check, so a telephone number is required. And then instead of date of birth, a lot of times this is misconstrued by people that may have rushed through this, but for an occupation-based guarantor, the date of birth is not required. It's only for people that are providing a Canadian passport to be a guarantor would put in their date of birth. For the occupation-based guarantor, they have to put in the name of their firm or organization. So for example, if they're a lawyer, the law firm that they work out of, or if they're a medical doctor, the hospital or the general practice that they're operating out of, or if it's a pharmacist, maybe the hospital again that they operate out of, or maybe a community pharmacy or high street pharmacy name from where they operate from. And then finally, instead of listing their home address, the occupation-based guarantor will list their business address. Okay, so again, the address of the law firm, the address of the hospital, etc. Then finally, again, they will just list here the amount of years that they've known you. Bear in mind, once again, they have to have known you for at least 2 years to qualify as a guarantor. Again, they will be signing on the back of your photo as well. It's the same thing for them as well. They're still a guarantor, so they sign on the back of one of your photos. And then finally, they will sign here in the strip. And then also they will write the date when they signed and the city and country which they were in when they signed. Section 3, previous Canadian travel document. So a real simple section, but definitely not one to overlook. So for as long as you've been issued a Canadian travel document in the past, could have been 5 years ago or 10 years ago, whenever it was issued to you, if one was issued to you, please list yes, and you'll provide the passport number of that passport and the date of its issue. If of course you still have it, it's not lost or destroyed or no longer with you. And then, but always providing this information can really help out, especially for offices abroad where they may not have issued your initial passport to you. It's just so that there can be an understanding that you do indeed have a passport history, and it could potentially speed up your application. So for sure, don't overlook this. And of course, you tick no if you never had a Canadian passport before, and this is, for example, your very first passport application. And it does say here, if the Canadian travel document is still valid, you must include it with your application. Of course, you must do this because to issue you a new Canadian passport, your old Canadian passport would have to be cancelled and snipped before your new one can be issued. So do not overlook this. And I personally would recommend that if you have had a Canadian passport, even if it has expired, still include it with your application. It will be returned to you anyway, but it can just definitely speed things up, and it helps the individual processing to realize that you do have passport history, so it can speed things up potentially. And then obviously down here you can just read here, would you like the previous passport returned to you? If not, it will be securely destroyed by the passport program to protect your personal information. Fantastic. And most times, if for example if you've got visas in your passport, you most probably do want it returned to you, so just hit that box, yes, please return it to me. Section 4, Proof of Canadian Citizenship. So for this section, what you will have in front of you, again, will, much like Section 1, will either be the manner in which you obtained Canadian citizenship. So if you were born in Canada, it would be your original Canadian birth certificate. And if you were born outside of Canada, it would be either a certificate of Canadian citizenship, or if you were slightly older, then a certificate of registration of birth abroad. And then in other cases, certificate of naturalization, and then also certificate of retention of Canadian citizenship. But those other certificates, apart from the certificate of Canadian citizenship, were only issued in certain times, so they weren't forever. They weren't issued all the time, so they may only apply to a small minority of applicants. But the main things that you have is either the birth certificate or the certificate of Canadian citizenship to fill in this section. If you're using the Canadian birth certificate to fill in this section, you'd fill in section A. So to be complete, if you're born in Canada, provide one of the documents listed below. And the key word here, for whether it's a Canadian birth certificate or it's your certificate of Canadian citizenship, original only. When you submit this application form either in person or by mail, you have to provide the original birth certificate, Canadian birth certificate, or the original certificate of Canadian citizenship. It cannot be copies, whether they're notarized or certified, doesn't matter. It has to be the original. I have to stress this. If you don't provide it, it's going to be a rejection, and obviously it's going to become a much more longer and time-consuming process for you. So if you're using the birth certificate here, you're going to fill in the registration number. So the registration number on the Canadian birth certificate is really easily identifiable. It actually is listed as a registration number, and it usually begins with the year of your birth. So it could be long ways, like it could be 1986, or it could just be 86, but that's the telltale sign for you. And then date of issue, again, date of issue will also be listed clearly for you as well. That's when the birth certificate was actually issued. So it's not the date of your birth, it would actually be when the birth certificate was issued by the province. And now if you're using the certificate of Canadian citizenship, you would tick this box if you're born outside of Canada, remember, and then you would quite simply provide the certificate number. So if you, for example, if you're using the plastic wallet-sized dual-sided laminated card, the certificate number would appear in red at the bottom of the front side, which is the side with your photo on it. That's a certificate number, and then date of issue will also appear on that same side, the photo side. Sometimes it's just the year, so it could just be 1999, and sometimes it's also just the month and year, so it could be 03 2001, for example. So however it appears, you can just list it verbatim on the card, so don't be perturbed if it doesn't have an exact day, like the 12th of December 1989, for example. It will appear either as a year or a month in the year, so just fill it in accordingly. And a little notice here: to be completed if you were born outside of Canada between February 15th 1977 and April 16th 1981 inclusive. Do be advised, you do not need to complete this section if you're presenting a certificate of Canadian citizenship issued after January 1st 2007. So if this does apply to you, to only a small amount of people, there's two sections here you need to look at. So it's born outside of Canada first and foremost. So if you're born in Canada, even if you were born within these years, don't worry about it. Don't worry about section 2 here, B2. That is not relevant to you because you were born inside of Canada. But if you were born outside of Canada between these years and your Canadian citizenship certificate was issued to you prior to January 1st 2007, you will fill in these sections pertaining to how you became a Canadian citizen. So you would fill them in according to your situation. Section 5, documents to support identity. First of all, be advised that you can provide either the original document, or you may include copies that are signed and dated. The person that signs them would be your guarantor. So remember, the person that fills in section 2 of the application form, either the Canadian passport holding guarantor or the occupation based guarantor, will sign and date photocopies of your identity document as well. Probably the best way to do it, really, if you don't want to be without a passport of another nationality, or for example a driving license or health card. And then there are two fields here that you can fill in with ID. Really, the 5 criteria that they're looking for are gender, your signature, your date of birth, your photo, and your name as you want it to appear on your passport application. So those are the 5 criteria you need to satisfy. If you have an ID that satisfies all criteria, you only really need to fill in one of these sections. You don't need to provide an abundance of ID if you've got one that meets it also. For example, a passport of another nationality, fantastic, or a driving license, fantastic, or a health card, fantastic. But if you have a couple of IDs that they don't necessarily have all the criteria on one card, but in combination they satisfy all the criteria, then you can provide 2 IDs, and that will satisfy the supporting identity section fully. And then rounding out this this page of the application, do not forget to sign here and date again when you signed the application. Section 6, really short section, but really important now that as a 10-year passport has now been introduced by Passport Canada, you now have the option for the period of validity that you want for your passport. So you can either have a 5-year passport or a 10-year passport. Be advised that you must tick one of these boxes or pick one of them, and that's how they'll know to issue you the passport validity of your choosing. Be advised that whether you pick a 5 or 10-year passport, both booklets have exactly the same amount of pages, which is 36. There is no longer an option for a jumbo book passport. So for example, if you're a frequent traveler and your passport fills up quite quickly, you may just want to opt for the 5-year passport, because you may very well not reap the benefit of a 10-year passport if, let's say, your passport gets filled up in about 5 or 6 years. Then the 10-year one is going to be fairly useless to you and will be an additional cost to you as well. So don't forget section 6 to fill in with the choice of your validity, 5 or 10 years. Section 7, so this is the additional personal information section. There's quite a bit going on here on this section, so let's break it down bit by bit so as not to get overwhelmed. So section 7A is regarding addresses. So they're interested in addresses that you've been at in the past 2 years. So if there's nothing different in terms of where you've been living now than where you were 2 years ago, so that'll be your main address on page 1 of the application, section 1, excuse me, then you will just simply tick this box, same as current home address, and then you can just move on to section B. However, if you have been at different addresses to the one that was on your current home address on section 1, you will complete them accordingly. So for example, maybe you were at university, or you took a year out and you were residing in another country or just another province or city, you will list them, the addresses, as the information is requested, so number, street, apartment, city, country, and postal or zip code, and then from the years, making sure they all tie up for the 2-year period. Okay, so don't be leaving any gaps. This can for sure cause delays in finding out this information at a later date, so make sure all your timeline syncs up nicely for the past 2 years. And then section 7B, this is pertaining to your occupation or perhaps education as well in the past 2 years. So you have 3 options, first of all, to tick, and then you'll provide the information accordingly. So you can either tick hours employed, full or part-time, and that will include being self-employed as well. I was in school. So you can do full or part-time school, education, secondary school, high school, college, university, for example. And then the other category, which would be being a homemaker, housewife, for example, unemployed or retired. And it can also include things like volunteering or traveling as well. And then once you've ticked the corresponding sections, and you can tick multiple ones as well. You may have been in school the first year, and then you might have got a graduate job, for example, in the second one. So you can tick multiple boxes as well. Or you might even have a period of unemployment when you're in between school and work, like many people do. So you can tick them accordingly. And then enter the full details below for the last 2 years. So once again, 2 years that you'll be providing information about. So either the employer, the school, or other. So for example, employer will be your employer's address, school will be the school address, or other could be, for example, if you're a homemaker, it will just be your home address, for example, and then name and then address. If you're self-employed, you just write self-employed here, and then you can just write, maybe if you're operating from home, you can just write the home address, or if it's another address, then you can just list that address there. A daytime telephone number for the establishment where you were, and then the field of employment or study. So for example, if you're a lawyer, you'd say law, or if you're studying chemistry, you write studying chemistry. And then again, the corresponding dates. Once again, don't forget to make sure that they all tie up for the 2-year period. Okay, nicely synced up. And then finally, section 7C is mother's maiden name. So this is really important as well, part of the security process. So it's your mother's surname at the time of her birth. Okay, so that's really important. That's the clue. So not her surname now. So if your mother took on a marital surname, that's not the surname they're looking for. It's her surname at the time of her birth. You're going to list that here, section 7C. Section 8, references. Not to be confused with the guarantor, which is found at section 2. References are two people, quite simply, that are 18 years or older, and they have known you, the applicant, for at least 2 years or more. And they cannot be your relatives, and they cannot be your guarantor from section 2 of this application. Okay, so those are the only caveats. Put it this way, a reference can be, for example, friends, neighbors, colleagues. Those are most of the criteria that are usually picked for references, and they can reside in any part of the world, as long as they speak the official languages of Canada, which are English or French, so that they can be communicated with if a reference check does arise. And that's the information you can provide for references. And very recently they've been expanded as well now, so actually cousins, aunts and uncles, for example, can now actually act as your reference as long as they do not reside at the same address as yourself. So that's another important factor which helps out tremendously for those that may struggle to find references. Aunts, uncles, cousins, nephews and nieces are applicable. They can be references as long as they're not residing at the same address as yourself. So here you'd be filling in the information for the reference. The reference is not filling in any sections here. They can if they want to, if they're in close proximity to you, but this is basically you're just filling in their details. There's no signatures, unlike the guarantor section. So I would very highly recommend that you at least consult the reference, asking their permission that they can be your reference, and just giving them a heads up that they are a reference out of common courtesy. For sure, if a reference check arises, you want them to know that they may very well be contacted. Of course, some people may have busy schedules, or they may just not want to have their details shared, and that should be respected. So here, for both fields of the references, you'll be providing the reference's surname, their given name, and the relationship between yourself and them. So for example, it will be friend, colleague, neighbor, cousin. They could be your aunt or your uncle, so on and so forth. And then their address. And they can either provide a home or business address. It's their choice, or you might want to consult with them what address to provide. And a daytime telephone number must be provided in case a reference check does arise. The reference must be contactable. And finally, how many years you've known that reference for. So remember, they have to have known you for at least 2 years. Okay, that's key. For them to qualify as a reference, they have to have known you for at least 2 years, and then you'll provide the same person again. A real easy way to maybe provide 2 references is maybe a Mr. and Mrs. So if you've got a next door neighbor, and there are a couple, it could be both Mr. and Mrs. that can each be a reference. They can be related to each other. References can be related to each other or in a relationship together. That's fine. They just can't be related to you. So Mr. and Mrs. would work. Maybe if you have a best friend and you also know their mother or father, that again would then become 2 references as well. So not as tricky as you first may think, and certainly much more easier if you're struggling with references. Maybe you're in another country, you don't know people in the country you're currently in. You can always go back to your country of residence or where you grew up. So for example, if you're in Canada, you had long-standing neighbors or friends or family. Those are also options that you can provide for your references. Section 9, emergency contact. First and foremost, this section is optional. It does not need to be filled in, but I highly recommend it, as I'll read out the disclaimer here anyway. We recommend that you provide the name of someone who would not normally travel with you. This information is helpful if you have an accident or become ill while traveling. Okay, so the key thing you need to remember when you are filling in this section, if you choose to, is that someone that is not someone that normally travels with you. Okay, so someone that is probably at home or in another country and they can be contacted. It's no good if they're in the same boat as yourself. If you were to have an accident or become ill whilst traveling, obviously they'd be aware of that. So you want someone that is not normally traveling with you. Okay, and then you just provide their surname, their given name, their relationship to you. So you could say uncle, godfather, brother, mother, sister, whoever it might be. That's how you list the relationship, and then a contactable number and email address will be preferable, and then obviously a current home address where they can also be reached. And then finally, winding out section 9, and the ending of this application will be, again, remembering to sign here as the applicant, and you will also be putting the date of your signature. So I hope this guide has been helpful to you in filling in the adult general passport application form, whether you are within Canada or applying outside of Canada. Hopefully this provided some salient information, clarified some things that you may not have been sure about, and just helped point you in the right direction. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like, please comment for any additional information or advice, or any other videos you'd like me to make about any forms that you're struggling with or would like some help or hints about, and I for sure will try my best to get you a video uploaded as soon as possible. And yes, please share, like, subscribe and comment. Thanks again for watching this video, and have a great day. Take care.